Chapter 21 of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6. This is a Librivox recording. All Librivox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay. Chapter 21, Retaliation. The rebel authorities watched the experiment of arming the blacks with the keenest apprehension and hostility. In Mr. Lincoln's order of July 22, 1862, directing military commanders to seize and use property, real or personal, for military purposes, and to employ persons of African descent as laborers, Jefferson Davis professed already to discover a wicked violation of the laws of war, apparently forgetting that his own generals were everywhere using such persons in military labor. When it was learned that Hunter and Phelps were endeavoring to organize Negro regiments, the language employed to express Southern affectation of surprise and protest bordered on the ludicrous. The best authenticated newspapers received from the United States, writes General Lee, announce as a fact that Major General Hunter has armed slaves for the murder of their masters, and has thus done all in his power to inaugurate a servile war, which is worse than that of the savage, inasmuch as it superadds other horrors to the indiscriminate slaughter of ages, sexes, and conditions. And Phelps is charged with imitating the bad example. General Halleck very properly returned this and another letter as insulting to the Government of the United States. A little later, the Confederate War Department issued a formal order that Major General Hunter and Brigadier General Phelps be no longer held and treated as public enemies of the Confederate States, but as outlaws, and that in the event of the capture of either of them or that of any other commissioned officer employed in drilling, organizing, or instructing slaves with a view to their armed service in this war, he shall not be regarded as a prisoner of war, but held in close confinement for execution as a felon at such time and place as the President shall order. Mr. Davis seems to have cultivated a sort of literary pride in these formulas of invective, for in his sensational proclamation of outlawry against General Butler and all commissioned officers in his command, he repeats, African slaves have not only been incited to insurrection by every license and encouragement, but numbers of them have actually been armed for a servile war, a war in its nature far exceeding the horrors and most merciless atrocities of savages. In this it was ordered that all Negro slaves captured in arms be at once delivered over to the executive authorities of the respective States to which they belong, to be dealt with according to the laws of said States, and that Butler and his commissioned officers, robbers and criminals deserving death, be, whenever captured, reserved for execution. President Lincoln's two proclamations of emancipation excited similar threats. About a week after the first was issued, it was made a subject of discussion in the Confederate Senate at Richmond, and a Confederate writer recorded in his diary the next day, "Some of the gravest of our senators favor the raising of the black flag, asking and giving no quarter hereafter." When the final proclamation reached Richmond, Jefferson Davis was writing his annual message to the rebel Congress, and he ransacked his dictionary for terms to stigmatize it. Our own detestation of those who have attempted the most execrable measure recorded in the history of guilty man is tempered by profound contempt for the impotent rage which it discloses. This new provocation also broadened his field of retaliation. He now declared that he would deliver such criminals as may attempt its execution. All commissioned officers of the United States captured in States embraced in the proclamation to the executives of such States to be punished for exciting servile insurrection. The Confederate Congress, while responding to the full degree of the proposed retaliation, nevertheless preferred to keep the power of such punishment in the hands of the central military authorities, apparently as promising a more certain and summary execution. That body passed a joint resolution approved by Davis May 1, 1863, which prescribed that white officers of negro Union soldiers shall, if captured, be put to death or be otherwise punished at the discretion of the court, the trial to take place before the military court attached to the army or corps making the capture, or such other military court as the Confederate President should designate. The Confederate Cabinet seems to have been quite ready to execute this law of summary retaliation prescribed by the Confederate Congress. In a letter of suggestions written by J.A. Seddon, the Confederate Secretary of War, to General E. Kirby Smith, commanding the Trans-Mississippi Department, under date of August 12, 1863, he said, "It is very probable that the forces employed by the enemy in guarding the river will consist in large measure of negro troops. I think I have already in previous communications intimated to you, as my own judgment, that a most marked distinction should be made in the treatment, when taken, of these negro troops and of the white men leading them. The latter had better be dealt with red-handed on the field or immediately thereafter; the former to be considered rather as deluded victims of the hypocrisy and malignity of the enemy, should not be driven to desperation, but received readily to mercy and encouraged to submit and return to their masters." When the Confederate threats regarding negro soldiers were first launched, the experiment had not yet been formally authorized by the Government, and as there was no probability that any early capture of such persons would be made by the enemy, no attention was paid to rebel orders and proclamations on the subject. A year later, however, when negro regiments were springing into full organization simultaneously in many places, the matter became one of grave import. As a rule, the black regiments were commanded by white officers, often selected, as was specially the case with the 54th Massachusetts, from the very best material, whose bravery in incurring this additional risk deserved the extra watchfulness and protection of the Government. The most elementary justice required that if it called the black man to do a soldier's duty, it must cover him with a soldier's right, and Northern sentiment was prompt in urging the claim. Frederick Douglass has related how he pressed the point upon Mr. Lincoln, and the President's reply. As to the exchange and general treatment of colored soldiers when taken prisoners of war, he should insist on their being entitled to all privileges of such prisoners. Mr. Lincoln admitted the justice of my demand for the promotion of colored soldiers for good conduct in the field, but on the matter of retaliation he differed from me entirely. I shall never forget the benignant expression of his face, the tearful look of his eye, and the quiver in his voice when he deprecated a resort to retaliatory measures. "Once again," said he, "I do not know where such a measure would stop." He said he could not take men out and kill them in cold blood for what was done by others. If he could get hold of the persons who were guilty of killing the colored prisoners in cold blood, the case would be different, but he could not kill the innocent for the guilty. Nevertheless, in view of the great success which attended the enlistment of black recruits, it became necessary for the Government to adopt a settled policy on the question, and on July 30, 1863, the President issued the following comprehensive order: "It is the duty of every government to give protection to its citizens of whatever class, color, or condition, and especially to those who are duly organized as soldiers in the public service. The law of nations and the usages and customs of war, as carried on by civilized powers, permit no distinction as to color in the treatment of prisoners of war as public enemies. To sell or enslave any captured person on account of his color, and for no offense against the laws of war, is a relapse into barbarism and a crime against the civilization of the age. The Government of the United States will give the same protection to all its soldiers, and if the enemy shall sell or enslave any one because of his color, the offense shall be punished by retaliation upon the enemy's prisoners in our possession. It is therefore ordered that for every soldier of the United States killed in violation of the laws of war, a rebel soldier shall be executed, and for every one enslaved by the enemy or sold into slavery, a rebel soldier shall be placed at hard labor on the public works and continued at such labor until the other shall be released and receive the treatment due to a prisoner of war. It is a gratification to record that the rebel government did not persist in the barbarous conduct it had officially announced, and that sanguinary retaliation did not become necessary. There were indeed some unimportant instances of imprisonment of captured blacks as hostages, for which a few rebel soldiers were ordered into confinement by General Halleck, but the cases were not pushed to extremity under executive sanction on either side. Much more serious excesses, however, occurred under the responsibility and conduct of individual officers. It is probable that most of them went unrecorded. In October 1862, when the guerrilla outrages in Missouri were in one of their moments of fiercest activity, a Union citizen of Palmyra was abducted and murdered under circumstances which clearly marked it as an instance of concerted and deliberate partisan revenge. In retaliation for this, Colonel John McNeil, the Union officer in local command, who was under orders to deal severely and summarily with this class of offenders, having demanded the perpetrators, which demand was not complied with, ordered the execution of 10 rebel guerrillas of the same neighborhood, and carried out the order with military publicity and formality. Even admitting the strong provocation, modern sentiment could scarcely justify a punishment tenfold as severe as that demanded by the Mosaic Law. But General McNeil has lately printed a letter explaining the circumstances, in which he says the 10 guerrillas executed, not one of whom but had committed murder under circumstances of atrocity, were selected from 22 who had previously been formally tried by a United States military commission and sentenced to death, so that their death was but hastened by the act of retaliation, the remaining 12 of the 22 convicted being soon afterwards shot in pursuance of their sentence by the officers in command at Macon City and Mexico, Missouri. Less than a month later, there was brief mention in a letter of the rebel Major General Holmes to the Confederate War Department of an analogous occurrence in northern Texas. A secret organization, he wrote, to resist the Confederate Conscript Act in northern Texas has resulted in the citizens organizing a jury of investigation, and I am informed they have tried and executed 40 of those convicted, and thus this summary procedure has probably crushed the incipient rebellion. Even without the details, the incident is a convincing explanation of the seeming unanimity for rebellion in that region. The most shocking occurrence of this character, however, followed the employment of Negro soldiers. We cannot adequately picture the vindictive rage of many rebel masters at seeing recent slaves uniformed and armed in defense of a government which had set them free. Under the barbarous institution to perpetuate which they committed treason and were ready to die, they had punished their human chattels with the unchecked lash, sold them on the auction block, hunted them with bloodhounds, and it is hardly to be wondered at that amid the license of war, individuals among them now and then thought to restore their domination by the aid of military slaughter. As an evidence that such thoughts existed here and there, we need only cite the language of Major General John C. Breckinridge, late Vice President of the United States. Writing under date of August 14, 1862, to the Union commander at Baton Rouge, he recites in a list of alleged outrages that information has reached these headquarters that Negro slaves are being organized and armed to be employed against us, and adds, I am authorized by Major General Van Dorn, commanding this department, to inform you that the above acts are regarded as in violation of the usage of civilized warfare, and that in future, upon any departure from these usages, he will raise the black flag and neither give nor ask quarter. Mere official bravado from however conspicuous a personage only deserves mention when, as in this instance, it illustrates a type of feeling which in one case at least manifested itself in an incident of shocking barbarity. In the spring of the year 1864, President Lincoln went to Baltimore to attend the opening of a large fair for the benefit of the Sanitary Commission. In concluding the address which he was called upon to make on that occasion, he said, "A painful rumor true, I fear, has reached us of the massacre by the rebel forces at Fort Pillow, in the west end of Tennessee, on the Mississippi River, of some 300 colored soldiers and white officers who had just been overpowered by their assailants. There seems to be some anxiety in the public mind whether the government is doing its duty to the colored soldier and to the service at this point. At the beginning of the war, and for some time, the use of colored troops was not contemplated, and how the change of purpose was wrought I will not now take time to explain. Upon a clear conviction of duty, I resolved to turn that element of strength to account, and I am responsible for it to the American people, to the Christian world, to history, and on my final account to God. Having determined to use the Negro as a soldier, there is no way but to give him all the protection given to any other soldier. The difficulty is not in stating the principle, but in practically applying it. It is a mistake to suppose the government is indifferent to this matter, or is not doing the best it can in regard to it. We do not today know that a colored soldier or white officer commanding colored soldiers has been massacred by the rebels when made a prisoner. We fear it, believe it, I may say, but we do not know it. To take the life of one of their prisoners on the assumption that they murder ours, when it is short of certainty that they do murder ours, might be too serious, too cruel a mistake. We are having the Fort Pillow affair thoroughly investigated, and such investigation will probably show conclusively how the truth is. If, after all that has been said, it shall turn out that there has been no massacre at Fort Pillow, it will be almost safe to say there has been none, and will be none elsewhere. If there has been the massacre of 300 there, or even the 10th part of 300, it will be conclusively proven, and being so proven, the retribution shall as surely come. It will be matter of grave consideration in what exact course to apply the retribution, but in the supposed case it must come. The investigation referred to by the President was made by the Committee on the Conduct of the War, and included the sworn testimony of about 80 witnesses, most of them actual participants in the occurrence. The committee found that Fort Pillow, Tennessee, situated on the Mississippi River and garrisoned by about 557 Union troops, of whom 262 were colored, was captured by assault by an overwhelming force of Confederates under General Forrest on April 12, 1864, and that of the men from 300 to 400 are known to have been killed at Fort Pillow, of whom at least 300 were murdered in cold blood after the post was in possession of the rebels, and our men had thrown down their arms and ceased to offer resistance. It further appears that this inhumanity was directed principally against the colored soldiers. The rebel general and his subordinates stoutly denied the accusation of vindictiveness, but their explanations and later evidence failed to shake the general substance of the committee's allegation and proof. Indeed, it would be difficult to refute the conclusiveness of the first report of General Forrest himself. On the third day after his exploit, he telegraphed to General Polk: I attacked Fort Pillow on the morning of the 12th instant with a part of Bell's and McCulloch's brigades, numbering blank, under Brigadier General J. R. Chalmers. After a short fight, we drove the enemy, 700 strong, into the fort under cover of their gunboats, and demanded a surrender, which was declined by Major L. W. Booth, commanding United States forces. I stormed the fort, and after a contest of 30 minutes, captured the entire garrison, killing 500 and taking 100 prisoners and a large amount of quartermaster stores. The officers in the fort were killed, including Major Booth. I sustained a loss of 20 killed and 60 wounded. The Confederate flag now floats over the fort. This astonishing result is further explained by the contemporaneous threats made officially by these Confederate officers. On the 25th of March preceding, in demanding the surrender of Paducah, Kentucky, General Forrest wrote: If you surrender, you shall be treated as prisoners of war. But if I have to storm your works, you may expect no quarter. And on the day following the Fort Pillow massacre, General A. Buford, one of Forrest's brigadiers, said in his demand for the surrender of Columbus, Kentucky, Should you surrender, the negroes now in arms will be returned to their masters. Should I, however, be compelled to take the place, no quarter will be shown to the negro troops whatever. The white troops will be treated as prisoners of war." And in a subsequent correspondence, Forrest wrote under date of June 20 to the Union General C.C. Washburne, "I regard captured negroes as I do other captured property, and not as captured soldiers." The language of these officers at Paducah and Columbus is a sufficient commentary on their achievement at Fort Pillow. The excuse of hot blood and sudden passion can hardly be urged in extenuation. For nearly a full year the subject had been under official scrutiny and debate. Their Secretary of War had long since officially suggested red-handed dealings on the field or immediately thereafter for white officers of colored regiments, with mercy for negro soldiers, that the latter might not be driven to desperation. Whether Forrest and others read a hidden meaning between the lines of the Confederate Secretary's letter, or whether they chose to defy the spirit it breathed, their acts have the appearance of a deliberate policy and intention. President Lincoln formally took up the consideration of the subject on the 3rd of May by writing to the several members of his Cabinet, "It is now quite certain that a large number of our colored soldiers, with their white officers, were by the rebel force massacred after they had surrendered at the recent capture of Fort Pillow. So much is known, though the evidence is not yet quite ready to be laid before me. Meanwhile, I will thank you to prepare and give me in writing your opinion as to what course the Government should take in the case." The answers of his advisers differed widely. Mr. Seward affirmed the duty of the Government to vindicate the right of all its soldiers to be regarded and treated as prisoners of war. Nevertheless, he urged great caution in any proceeding looking to retaliation, and advised for the present only the setting apart and rigorous confinement of an equal number of Confederate prisoners as hostages until the rebel Government could be called upon to explain or disavow the cruelties and give pledges that they should not be repeated. Mr. Chase held the same view, except that he advised that the hostages should be selected from rebel prisoners of highest rank, in number equivalent, according to the rules of exchange, to the officers and men murdered at Fort Pillow. Mr. Stanton also advised that the hostages be selected from rebel officers, that Forrest, Chalmers, and all officers and men concerned in the Fort Pillow massacre be excluded from the benefit of the President's proclamation of amnesty and from the privilege of exchange, and their delivery for punishment be demanded from the Richmond authorities, in default of which delivery the President should take such measures against the hostages as the state of things then existing might make necessary. The advice of Mr. Welles was essentially the same as that of Mr. Stanton. Mr. Blair, on the contrary, took different ground. "There are 2 reasons," he wrote, "which would prevent me from ordering the execution of prisoners, man for man, in retaliation for the massacre at Fort Pillow. First, that I do not think the measure would be justified by the rules of civilized warfare, even in a contest between alien enemies. Second, because even if allowable in such a contest, it would not be just in itself or expedient in the present contest, and the inclination of my mind is to pursue the actual offenders alone in such cases as the present, to order the most energetic measures for their capture and the most summary punishment when captured. A proclamation or order that the guilty individuals are to be hunted down will have far greater terrors and be far more effectual to prevent the repetition of the crime than the punishment of parties not concerned in that crime." Mr. Bates agreed in opinion with Mr. Blair. He would demand of the enemy a disavowal or an avowal of the act. If he disavow it, then demand the surrender of the generals guilty of the Fort Pillow massacre, to be dealt with at your discretion. If he avow and justify the act, then instruct your commanders to cause instant execution upon any and all participants in the massacre, whether officers or privates who should fall into their power. He added, "I would have no compact with the enemy for mutual slaughter, no cartel of blood and murder, no stipulation to the effect that if you murder one of my men, I will murder one of yours. Retaliation is not mere justice. it is avowedly revenge, and is wholly unjustifiable in law and conscience, unless adopted for the sole purposes of punishing past crime, and of giving a salutary and blood-saving warning against its repetition. Mr. Usher also joined in the opinion that punishment should not be visited upon innocent persons, but he urged that the government should set apart for execution an equal number of prisoners who, since the massacre, have been or may hereafter from time to time be captured from Forrest's command. He also urged another reason. We are upon the eve of an impending battle. Until the result shall have been known, it seems to me to be inexpedient to take any extreme action in the premises. If favorable to our arms, we may retaliate as far as the laws of war and humanity will permit. If disastrous and extreme measures should have been adopted, we may be placed in a position of great embarrassment and forced to forego our threatened purpose in order to avoid a worse calamity. It is probable that this view took a deep hold upon the Cabinet. Grant was about entering upon his Wilderness campaign, and its rapid succession of bloody conflicts crowded out of view and consideration a topic so difficult and so hazardous as wholesale retaliation for the Fort Pillow barbarity, which on one hand strict justice demanded, and which on the other enlightened humanity forbade. In these opposing duties there could be little doubt toward which the kind heart of the President would incline. He had long since laid down for himself a rule of conduct applicable to this class of cases. In his annual message of December 3, 1861, he had declared, "In considering the policy to be adopted for suppressing the insurrection, I have been anxious and careful that the inevitable conflict for this purpose shall not degenerate into a violent and remorseless revolutionary struggle." It does not appear that the Fort Pillow question was ever seriously renewed in the Cabinet or definitely concluded by the President. The proceedings relating to retaliation, which we have thus far sketched, bring us back to another and by no means the least interesting phase of the general subject of Negro soldiers. We may here anticipate the course of events so far as to say that in the autumn and winter of 1864 the cause of the South was already lost, and the collapse of the Confederate Government plainly foreshadowed to all except the leaders, whose infatuation and wounded vanity made them unwilling to acknowledge and accept defeat. Yet this effort to avoid confession of error in one direction compelled them to admit it in another. They had seceded for slavery, had made it the cornerstone of their government, had anathematized President Lincoln for his decrees of emancipation, had pronounced the ban of outlawry, and had prescribed the sentence of death against every white officer who might dare to command Negro troops. But now, in their extremity, some of them proposed to throw consistency to the winds, and themselves commit the acts upon which they had invoked the reprobation of mankind, and for which they had ordained extreme punishment. It would be difficult to estimate the benefit they had derived from the direct military labor of the slave, especially in building fortifications. They now proposed not only to put arms in his hands and make him a soldier to fight in the ranks, but also as a final step to emancipate him for the service. Even the flexible political conscience of Jefferson Davis, however, winced a little at the bold abandonment of principle which this policy involved, and in his message of November 7, 1864, to the Confederate Congress, he argued the question with the reluctance of a man preparing to walk over live coals. We have not space to abridge his hair-splitting arguments to justify the South in what they had so vociferously denounced when done by the North. The sum of his recommendation is that the 20,000 slaves then employed in various labors in the Confederate Army should be increased to 40,000, be drilled in camping, marching, and parking trains, and employed as a pioneer and engineer laborer. He says, "I must dissent from those who advise a general levy and arming of the slaves for the duty of soldiers. Until our white population shall prove insufficient for the armies we require and can afford to keep in the field, to employ as a soldier the Negro who has merely been trained to labor, and as a laborer, the white man accustomed from his youth to the use of firearms, would scarcely be deemed wise or advantageous by any. And this is the question now before us. But should the alternative ever be presented, of subjugation or of the employment of the slave as a soldier, there seems no reason to doubt what should then be our decision. While he dwells on the improbable contingency of our need of resorting to this element of resistance, he nevertheless points out that the Confederate Government might buy the slave from his master and engage to liberate him as a reward for faithful military service. Mr. Davis's hesitating and tentative recommendation was seed sown on barren ground. If the dose was unpalatable to him, it appears to have been yet more bitter to the members of the Confederate Congress, who doubtless felt, as has been pithily expressed by a Confederate writer, that it was an admission of the inherent injustice of slavery, that if the Negro was fit to be a soldier, he was not fit to be a slave, that the proposition cut under the traditions and theories of 3 generations in the South, and that by a few strokes of the pen the Confederate Government had subscribed to the main tenet of the abolition party in the North and all its consequences, standing exposed and stultified before the world. As the fall of the Confederacy drew nigh, the stress of disaster compelled his acceptance of the distasteful alternative, though even then he could not refrain from expressing the hope that the grim necessity would somehow be averted. On the 30th of March, 1865, he wrote to Governor William Smith of Virginia: "I am happy to receive your assurance of success, as well as your promise to seek legislation to secure unmistakably freedom to the slave who shall enter the army with a right to return to his old home when he shall have been honorably discharged from the military service. I remain of the opinion that we should confine our first efforts to getting volunteers, and would prefer that you would adopt such measures as would advance that mode of recruiting rather than that concerning which you make inquiry, to wit, by issuing a requisition for the slaves as authorized by the statutes of Virginia." They debated the unwelcome subject with qualms and grimaces through November, December, January, and most of February. On the 11th of January, and again on the 18th of February, the proposal received a notable support in letters from General Lee, in which he declared the measure of employing negro soldiers not only expedient but necessary, and recommended that the Confederate President be empowered to call upon individuals or States for such as they are willing to contribute, with the condition of emancipation to all enrolled. Even under this pressure, however, the rebel lawmakers could not wholly conquer their repugnance. Nearly 6 weeks more elapsed, and the fall of Richmond was already imminent, when on the 30th of March, 1865, the Confederate Congress passed an act upon the subject, which provided that if under the previous sections of this act the President shall not be able to raise a sufficient number of troops to prosecute the war successfully and maintain the sovereignty of the States and the independence of the Confederate States, then he is hereby authorized to call on each State, whenever he thinks it expedient, for her quota of 300,000 troops, in addition to those subject to military service under existing laws, or so many thereof as the President may deem necessary for the purposes herein mentioned, to be raised from such of the population, irrespective of color, in each State as the proper authorities thereof may determine. The Confederate writer Pollard sums up the result as follows: "The law, as finally enacted, was merely to authorize the President to receive into the military service such able-bodied slaves as might be patriotically tendered by their masters, to be employed in whatever capacity he might direct. No change to be made in the relation of owners of slaves, at least so far as it appeared in the bill." The fruits of this emasculated measure were 2 companies of blacks, organized from some negro vagabonds in Richmond, which were allowed to give balls at the Libby prison, and were exhibited in fine fresh uniforms on Capitol Square as decoys to obtain sable recruits. But the mass of their colored brethren looked on the parade with unenvious eyes, and little boys exhibited the early prejudices of race by pelting the fine uniforms with mud. End of chapter 21. End of Abraham Lincoln, A History, Volume 6, by John Hay and John George Nicolay.